The air in the Blue Dahlia was thick enough to drink, a humid cocktail of aged bourbon, chicory coffee, and the ghosts of 100 years of music. Rain pattered against the tall, wrought-iron-grilled windows, a soft percussion to the city's unceasing rhythm. Here, in the heart of New Orleans' French Quarter, time wasn't a straight line but a slow, meandering river, and tonight, Eliza Moreau's voice was the current pulling everyone under. On a small, dimly lit stage, bathed in a single amber spotlight, she stood with her eyes closed, one hand resting on the microphone stand. The music wasn't just in her, it was her. A smoky, soulful melody drifted from her lips, weaving a tale of heartbreak and resilience that felt both ancient and intimately present. Every note was a velvet touch, every pause a held breath. She wasn't just a singer performing for tourists and locals. She was a storyteller, a priestess tending to the city's weary soul. From a shadowed alcove in the back, where the darkness clung to the red velvet upholstery, Marco the Ghost DeLuca watched his wife. To the casual observer, he was just another patron, a man in a tailored but unassuming dark suit, his features handsome but forgettable. He ran a successful seafood import/export company, a respectable, profitable business that explained his quiet wealth. He was known as a sharp but fair negotiator, a man who kept his word. But in the circles that mattered, in the humid back rooms and union halls that truly ran the city, he was known only as DeLuca, and his gaze, fixed on the woman on stage, held a reverence that bordered on worship. She was the anchor of his world, the single point of light in the shadows he commanded. He didn't need to be seen. He only needed to see her. When her set finished, the applause was a wave of genuine appreciation, not just polite courtesy. Eliza opened her eyes, a soft, grateful smile gracing her lips as she gave a slight bow. Stepping off the stage, she moved through the tables, the scent of her gardenia perfume trailing behind her. She exchanged a quiet word with Jean-Paul, the club's perpetually nervous manager, then headed toward the bar for a glass of water. That's when they arrived. Senator Thompson and his son Carter swept in with an entourage of two, their presence sucking the quiet intimacy from the room. They wore suits that were too sharp, too clean for the Dahlia's lived-in elegance, their voices a decibel too loud. The senator, a man in his late 50s with silver hair and a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes, was a titan of Louisiana politics. Carter, his heir apparent, was a younger, brasher version, his face flushed with bourbon and entitlement. They settled into a large, secluded booth, the one Marco usually occupied when he wasn't in his preferred shadows. As Eliza passed, a single phrase cut through the club's low murmur, sharp and venomous. "Make the Port Authority problem disappear," the senator was saying to one of his aides, his voice a low growl. "The zoning variance is non-negotiable. I don't care what it takes." Eliza didn't mean to listen, but the words were unavoidable. She felt a prickle of unease. She had been born and raised in this city. She knew the difference between business and the kind of business that left stains. She glanced over instinctively, and for a fraction of a second, her eyes met Carter's. He didn't see a person. He saw a nuisance, a fly on the wall. He smirked, a cruel twist of his lips, before turning back to his father, dismissing her as utterly insignificant. Shaken, she retrieved her water and retreated to the small dressing room, the senator's words echoing in her mind. For her final set, Eliza chose a slow, mournful ballad, a piece that required absolute stillness from the audience. The saxophone player began with a long, haunting note, and Eliza's voice joined it, a whisper of sound that grew into a powerful lament. But the spell was broken by a sudden burst of laughter from the Thompsons' booth. They were talking loudly, clinking glasses, completely oblivious to the performance they were disrupting. A few patrons shot annoyed glances in their direction, but no one dared to say a word. The air grew tense. Jean-Paul wrung his hands behind the bar, his face pale with fear. He would never confront a man like Senator Thompson. Eliza felt a protective fire ignite in her chest, not for herself, but for the music, for the sanctity of this space. She was a professional. Pausing gracefully as the song ended, she held the microphone, her knuckles white. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice calm but clear, carrying across the silent room. "We have just one more song for you tonight. We'd be so grateful if you could help us keep the magic alive for these last few moments." It was a gentle, impersonal request, addressed to the entire room, but Carter Thompson took it as a direct challenge. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. "Are you talking to us?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. He stood, swaying slightly. "Honey, my father's campaign donors are practically paying your salary tonight. You're the background music, not the main event." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Eliza stood frozen, the amber light suddenly feeling like an interrogation lamp. Before she could respond, Senator Thompson sealed the humiliation. He chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound of pure arrogance, and waved a dismissive hand in her direction. "Son, don't mind the help," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Just a pretty little songbird with ruffled feathers." He then looked directly at Eliza, put a finger to his lips in a mocking "shush," and winked at one of his associates. The club, which had been simmering with tension, went dead silent. The insult was absolute. It wasn't a physical blow, but it was a public execution of her artistry, her dignity. In that moment, she wasn't Eliza Moreau, the celebrated voice of the quarter. She was just the help, an object to be silenced. Her throat tightened, the notes of her final song trapped in her chest. Somehow, she got through it. The song was a ghost of what it should have been. Her voice strained, the emotion hollowed out by shame. The applause at the end was scattered, uncertain. She mumbled a thank you and fled the stage, her face burning. She didn't look toward Marco's alcove. She couldn't bear for him to see her like this, small, powerless, exposed. In the cramped dressing room, surrounded by posters of jazz legends who had once graced the same stage, she sank onto a stool, the senator's mocking "shush" replaying in her mind. She didn't cry. Tears felt like a surrender. Instead, a cold, quiet anger began to settle in her bones. The door opened softly. It was Marco. He didn't ask what was wrong. His eyes, which had followed every moment from the shadows, already held the answer. He walked over, his presence filling the small room, a silent, comforting weight. He said nothing, simply took her coat from its hook and held it open for her. His movements were calm, deliberate, but she could see the muscle twitching in his jaw, a single telltale sign of the storm gathering beneath his placid surface. As she slipped her arms into the coat, his hands rested on her shoulders for a moment, a touch that was both gentle and possessive. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken rage. As they walked out the back exit into the rain-slicked alley, his voice was a low murmur, barely audible over the downpour. Who were they? It wasn't a question born of curiosity. It was a request for a name, a target. Senator Thompson, she whispered, her voice hoarse, and his son. Marco simply nodded, his face unreadable in the dim light. He opened an umbrella, holding it over her as he guided her toward their waiting car. There were no promises of violence, no grand declarations of revenge. There was only the cold, dangerous stillness in his eyes and the firm, protective grip of his hand as he opened her door. The drive home through the glistening, lamplit streets of New Orleans was silent. He held her hand, his thumb stroking gentle circles over her knuckles. Eliza leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, the city lights blurring through her unshed tears. She didn't know what he was thinking, what he was capable of. She only knew the man who sold shrimp and oysters by day was not the man sitting beside her now. The quiet businessman was gone. In his place sat the ghost, the man who owned the city's lifelines. The Port King was awake, and in the silent, humming car, a war had just been declared. The senator just didn't know he was already losing. The heavy oak door of their Garden District home clicked shut, sealing them inside a world of quiet elegance that felt a universe away from the blue dahlia's raw emotion. The air here smelled of rain-washed jasmine from the courtyard and old, well-cared-for books. It was a sanctuary, a place Marco had built for Eliza, brick by brick, deal by deal, to keep the city's grime from ever touching her. Tonight, he had failed. The grime had not only touched her, it had been thrown in her face. Eliza slipped off her coat, her movements weary. The cold anger that had sustained her was beginning to fray, leaving behind a deep, aching exhaustion. "I'm going to take a shower," she said, her voice a near whisper, not quite meeting his eyes. I want to wash it all off." Marco watched her ascend the winding staircase, her silhouette framed by the grand, arched window on the landing. He saw not the celebrated singer, but the young woman he'd first met years ago, the one with fire in her eyes and a voice that could break your heart. He had built his legitimate empire as a fortress around her, a buffer between her art and his reality. He thought it was impenetrable. He had been wrong. He didn't follow her. Instead, he walked into his study, a room paneled in dark cypress wood, the only light coming from a single green banker's lamp on his massive desk. The room was a facade, filled with shipping manifests, nautical charts, and ledgers for DeLuca seafood imports. But beneath the legitimate paperwork, in a locked drawer, was another set of books, the ones that detailed the true currents of power in New Orleans. He unlocked the drawer, but didn't open it. He didn't need to. The entire network was mapped in his mind. Every union boss who owed him a favor, every customs official on his payroll, every politician whose secrets he held in escrow. He had spent 2 decades building this silent machinery, not for wealth, but for control, for insulation, for the quiet life he and Eliza shared. Senator Thompson, in his arrogance, had just thrown a wrench into the heart of that machine. A fatal miscalculation. Marco picked up a secure, unlisted phone from his desk and dialed a single number. It rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. "Yeah. Silas, wake up." Silas Benoit had run the Longshoremen's Union at the port of New Orleans for 30 years. He was a man carved from the cypress swamps, with skin like leather and eyes that had seen everything. He was loyal to Marco not out of fear, but out of a shared history and a deep-seated understanding of how the city truly worked. "I'm awake, Marco. What's shaken?" "Senator Thompson," Marco said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "He has friends, people who fund his campaigns. I need to know who they are and what they're moving through my port." There was a pause on the other end, the only sound the distant moan of a foghorn. Silas didn't ask why. He knew better. "Thompson. Yeah, the big sugar man and the cotton exporter. Boudreaux and Sterling. They got his back pocket lined with gold. Boudreaux's got a big shipment of raw sugar heading for the refinery, scheduled to load out tomorrow morning. Sterling's got 3 containers of prime cotton bound for Belgium, leaving on the Maersk Phoenix at dawn." "Good." Marco's gaze drifted to a map of the port hanging on the wall, a complex web of docks, channels, and terminals. His web. "Silas, tomorrow morning the cranes at Terminal 4 are going to need some unexpected maintenance. A hydraulic failure, maybe. Something that takes at least 48 hours to fix." Silas grunted in understanding. Terminal 4 was where the Maersk Phoenix was birthed. "And Boudreaux's sugar?" "Your men," Marco said, the command implicit. "They're overworked. The equipment feels unsafe. They're concerned about their overtime pay. They need to have a conversation about it. A long one. Right on the docks, starting at 5 a.m. "A safety stand-down. Spontaneous-like," Silas confirmed, a hint of grim satisfaction in his voice. "Consider it done, Marco. Those boys were looking for a reason to sit down anyway." "Find a reason," Marco ordered. "And Silas, make sure the reason is loud enough for the papers to hear, but not so loud they trace it back here. Keep it about the Union. Keep it clean." "Always do." The line went dead. Marco placed the phone back in its cradle. The first 2 moves had been made. It wasn't a show of force. It was a subtle constriction, like a python tightening its coils. Boudreaux's sugar would rot on the docks, incurring massive demurrage fees. Sterling's cotton would miss its vessel, jeopardizing a multi-million-dollar contract. The financial pain would be acute, and the first people they would call to complain would be their man in Washington, Senator Thompson. He heard the water from the shower stop upstairs. He locked the drawer, the quiet click of the mechanism echoing in the silent room. When he went upstairs, he found Eliza sitting on the edge of their bed, wrapped in a thick robe, her damp hair coiled in a towel. The defiance was gone from her eyes, replaced by a fragile vulnerability that tore at him. "Feeling better?" he asked, his voice softening, the cold strategist melting away to reveal the husband. She nodded, though her gaze was distant. "I keep replaying it in my head, the way he looked at me, like I was nothing. Just an inconvenience." "You are everything," he said, sitting beside her, taking her hand. His own hands, which had just set in motion a plot to dismantle a man's career, were surprisingly gentle. "And he is nothing. He just doesn't know it yet." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw the flicker of something cold and hard deep in his eyes. It was a look she had only seen a few times before, a glimpse into the part of his world she had tacitly agreed never to question. "Marco, don't do anything foolish." "Foolishness is their game, Eliza," he said, lifting her hand to his lips. "My game is chess." The first call to Senator Thompson's D.C. office came at 7:30 a.m. Eastern Time. He was in a breakfast meeting with a lobbyist, laughing over a plate of eggs Benedict, when his chief of staff, a perpetually stressed man named David, interrupted. "Sir, apologies. It's Robert Boudreau on your private line. He sounds agitated." Thompson excused himself, annoyance clouding his features. "Robert, what's so important it can't wait until office hours?" "My shipment, Bill." Boudreau's voice was a panicked squawk. "It's stuck. The damn longshoremen have walked off. They're claiming unsafe equipment, right when my sugar is supposed to be loaded. Every hour it sits there is costing me a fortune." Thompson's political smile hardened into a frown. "A union dispute? I'll make a call to the port director. Get it sorted." He hung up, annoyed at the inconvenience. 10 minutes later, as he was signaling for more coffee, David appeared again, his face even paler. "It's John Sterling, sir. The cranes at Terminal 4 are all down. His cotton shipment is going to miss the Phoenix." Thompson put his fork down. "What do you mean by down?" "Mechanical failure, they're saying. The whole terminal is paralyzed. Sterling is threatening to pull his contribution to the re-election fund if we can't fix this." 2 major donors, 2 critical shipments, 2 different terminals, on the same morning. The hair on the back of Thompson's neck prickled. This was no longer an inconvenience. This was a message. He abruptly ended his meeting and strode back to his office, barking orders at David. "Get the port director on the line, now, and find my son." Carter Thompson answered on the 3rd ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Dad? What's going on?" "Get dressed and get down to my office. We have a problem." "What kind of problem?" "The kind that happens when you piss off the wrong people," Thompson snapped, slamming the phone down. His mind was racing. Who had the power to shut down 2 separate operations at the port with such precision? A rival politician? A disgruntled corporate competitor? His thoughts kept circling back to the night at the Blue Dahlia. The singer. The way she had looked at him after the insult. He'd dismissed her, but the city was a strange place, full of tangled alliances. Could it be? He shook his head. Impossible. She was nobody. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of a different cafe in the French Quarter, Marco DeLuca sat across from a man named Antoine Devereaux. Antoine was a journalist for the New Orleans Tribune, a man with an insatiable curiosity and a dwindling faith in his profession. He had a reputation for digging into stories no one else would touch, a fact Marco had cultivated and used for years. "Antoine," Marco began, pushing a plain manila envelope across the table. "A little something for your time." Antoine didn't touch the envelope. He knew it contained enough cash to cover his mortgage for the next 6 months. "What's the story, Marco?" "There is no story. Just a question." Marco's eyes were steady. "Senator Thompson has been pushing very hard for a zoning variance on the new container terminal project. I'm curious why. I'm curious who stands to benefit. I'm curious if all the environmental impact studies were done properly." Antoine's journalistic senses tingled. This was the Port Authority problem Eliza had overheard. "You're telling me to look into the senator's pet project?" "I'm telling you to follow a thread," Marco corrected him gently. "Sometimes, when you pull on a single thread, a whole tapestry unravels. You're good at pulling threads, Antoine." He stood up, leaving his untouched coffee on the table. "Let me know what you find." As Marco walked out into the humid morning air, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Silas. Stand down is holding. Boudreaux is screaming. Cranes are dead in the water. Sterling is threatening lawsuits. The Hornets are buzzing, boss. Marco typed a simple reply. Let them buzz. He got into his car, the engine a low, powerful hum. The first tremors were shaking the senator's foundations. The financial pressure was being applied. The media narrative was being seeded. It was all happening exactly as he'd planned. Quietly, systematically, and completely deniably. That evening, he came home to the sound of Eliza practicing at the piano, a soft, improvisational melody that filled the house with a sense of peace. The local news was playing softly on the television in the living room. Officials at the port of New Orleans are calling the widespread disruptions a coincidence of unfortunate events. But shippers are skeptical, as both a major labor dispute and a critical equipment failure have brought parts of the port to a standstill, delaying millions of dollars in goods. Eliza stopped playing, her head tilted. Did you hear that? Trouble at the port. Marco came up behind her, placing his hands on her shoulders, his touch warm and steady. There's always trouble at the port. Amore. She leaned back into him, but her eyes were fixed on the television screen, where an image of a frustrated-looking Senator Thompson was being shown. A small, knowing frown touched her lips. She didn't understand the how or the why, but she could feel the subtle shift in the city's currents. She felt the first faint tremor of the Port King's gambit, and she knew with a certainty that was both terrifying and thrilling that it was all for her. The sterile, climate-controlled air of Senator Thompson's Washington, D.C. office felt suffocating. For 2 days, the room had been a command center for a war he couldn't see, fighting an enemy who left no footprints. The relentless assault had been silent, precise, and utterly devastating. His desk was littered with empty coffee cups and printouts of shipping manifests that were now worthless pieces of paper. His political career, once a gleaming edifice of ambition and backroom deals, was beginning to show cracks in its foundation. "It's a coordinated attack, I'm telling you," he bellowed into the phone, his voice hoarse with frustration. On the other end, the port director, a man he had personally appointed, sounded like a broken record. "Bill, my hands are tied," the director whined. "The union is citing federal safety regulations. The crane maintenance company is claiming a parts shortage from their supplier in Germany. These are legitimate, documented issues. If I try to force them back to work, I'll have the Department of Labor and OSHA all over me. It's out of my hands." "Out of your hands?" Thompson seethed. "I put you in that chair to put things in your hands." He slammed the phone down, the plastic cracking under the force. Every door he pushed on was locked. Every lever he pulled was disconnected. It was like fighting a ghost. His son, Carter, who had been sulking on the leather sofa in the corner, finally spoke up, his voice laced with the petulant confidence of a man who had never solved a problem without his father's checkbook. "So just handle it, Dad. Send some guys down to the docks. Show them who's boss. A few cracked heads, and I bet those union guys get back to work real quick." Thompson whirled on him, his eyes blazing with a fury Carter had never seen. "You think this is a bar fight? You think this is about muscle?" he spat. "This is about power, you idiot. Real power, the kind you don't see until it's wrapped around your throat. Someone is pulling the strings to this entire city, and we don't even know who it is." But even as he said it, a memory surfaced, unbidden. The dark, quiet man in the back of the blue Dahlia. The one with the unreadable eyes who had watched the entire incident with a chilling stillness. the one his wife had briefly spoken to before leaving. He remembered his name now. DeLuca. The seafood guy. It seemed preposterous. A shrimp importer couldn't orchestrate this. And yet, the port, the unions, the quiet, invisible control. The pieces were there, but they formed a picture so terrifying he refused to look at it. His chief of staff, David, entered the room, his face the color of ash. "Sir, John Sterling just pulled his funding. All of it. He said, and I quote, 'I'm not tying my fortunes to a sinking ship.' Robert Boudreau is threatening to do the same." The news hit Thompson like a physical blow. This was no longer about delayed shipments. This was about political survival. Without Sterling and Boudreau, his re-election campaign was crippled. He was being bled dry, and he couldn't find the wound. "Get me everything we have on the unions," he commanded, his voice a low, desperate growl. "I want to know who runs them. Not the public face, the real boss. I want a name." As David scurried out, Thompson sank into his chair, the weight of his collapsing world pressing down on him. The ghost was starting to take shape. 200 miles south, in the humid archives of the New Orleans Tribune, Antoine Devereaux felt the familiar thrill of the hunt. Marco DeLuca's thread had proven to be a rope, and Antoine was pulling on it with all his might. The official paperwork for the new terminal project was pristine, a monument to bureaucratic transparency. But Antoine had been a journalist in Louisiana long enough to know that the real story was never in the official documents. He started digging into the subcontractors. The environmental surveys had been outsourced to a firm called Bayou Environmental Solutions, LLC. On the surface, it was a small, reputable company. But a little more digging into its incorporation papers revealed its ownership structure. A parent company, registered in Delaware, named Pelican Holdings Group. This was the shell. This was where the truth was buried. Antoine spent the next 24 hours fueled by coffee and adrenaline, cross-referencing property deeds, campaign finance records, and old newspaper clippings. And then he found it. A land purchase from 6 years prior. A large, seemingly useless tract of swampland adjacent to the proposed terminal site, bought for pennies on the dollar by Pelican Holdings Group. The same land that, once the terminal was built and the area was developed, would be worth 100 times its purchase price. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place when he uncovered the signatory on the Pelican Holdings deed. It wasn't the senator. It was his brother-in-law, a man with no obvious business acumen who ran a struggling fishing tackle shop in Lafayette. It was the perfect cutout, a layer of plausible deniability. The senator wasn't just pushing for a project to benefit his city. He was engaged in insider trading, using his political influence to enrich his own family on the taxpayer's dime. Antoine leaned back in his chair, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across his face. This was it. The kind of story that didn't just win awards. It ended careers. He picked up his phone, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and fear. He knew who to call. "Marco," he said, his voice low. "I think I've unraveled your tapestry." "Tell me." Marco's voice was calm, expectant. Antoine laid it all out. The shell company, the land deal, the brother-in-law. When he was finished, there was a moment of silence on the other end. "You have the documents?" Marco asked. "Scanned and secured. This is ironclad, Marco. It'll bring him down." "Good work, Antoine," Marco said. and the praise felt more valuable than the cash in the envelope. Write the story, print it. Front page, tomorrow morning. The paper's lawyers will want to sit on this for a week, vet everything. They will run it tomorrow, Marco stated, not as a request, but as a fact. Don't worry about the lawyers. I own the man who owns the paper. Just write the truth. The line went dead. Antoine stared at his phone, a shiver running down his spine. I own the man who owns the paper. In that single sentence, he understood the true, terrifying scope of Marco DeLuca's power. He wasn't just a source. He was the architect of the entire game. Antoine turned back to his keyboard and began to write. That night, the DeLuca house was quiet. Rain was falling again, a gentle, lulling rhythm on the slate roof. Marco stood in the kitchen, methodically preparing a simple meal of pan-seared redfish and fresh greens. The act of cooking, of providing, was a ritual for him, a way to anchor himself in the simple reality of his life with Eliza. She came and stood in the doorway, watching him. She had seen the news reports all day, the chaos at the port, the growing pressure on Senator Thompson. She saw the way his political opponents were beginning to circle, smelling blood in the water. She was not a naive woman. She knew coincidences of this magnitude didn't exist, not in New Orleans. The port is still a mess, she said, her voice neutral. I heard, he replied, not turning from the stove. He expertly flipped the fish, the skin sizzling as it hit the hot cast iron. They're saying the senator is in trouble, that his biggest donors are furious. Politics is a messy business. She walked further into the room, coming to stand beside him. She could smell the faint scent of the sea on his clothes, a constant reminder of his trade, both the one she knew and the one she didn't. This isn't just business, is it, Marco? She asked softly, her eyes searching his profile. This is for me. He turned off the heat and finally looked at her. The coldness was gone from his eyes, replaced by that deep, unwavering devotion that was hers alone. He didn't deny it. To lie to her would be a greater sin than sinking 1,000 ships. He dishonored you, Eliza, he said, his voice a low rumble. He tried to silence your voice in a place that is sacred to you. To this city, there are lines that do not get crossed. He crossed one. So you're, what, ruining him? The scale of it was hard for her to grasp. I am reminding him of the natural order of things, he said, taking the pan off the stove. He thought power came from a title, from a sign on an office door. Real power here comes from the water. It comes from the men who work the docks. It comes from the currents that flow in and out of this city. He tried to dam the current, so I am diverting the river. A chill traced its way down her spine. It was the most he had ever revealed about his world, and the calm, almost philosophical way he described it was more frightening than any threat of violence. And what happens when the river is diverted? She asked. Things that can no longer grow, wither and die, he said simply. He began to plate the food, his movements once again those of a husband preparing dinner, not a king commanding his empire. Now let's eat. You have a show tomorrow. You need your strength. She said nothing more, but as they sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, the rain whispering against the windows, she understood. This wasn't just revenge. It was a restoration of balance. He wasn't just punishing a man. He was defending the sanctity of her art, of her soul. And she knew, as she picked up her fork, that she was loved by a man who would move the tides themselves to protect her. The thought was equal parts terrifying and exhilarating. The next morning, the New Orleans Tribune hit the streets like a thunderclap. Splashed across the front page in a bold, accusatory headline was Antoine's story, Senator for Sale, Thompson's terminal deal linked to secret family land grab. The story was a masterclass in investigative journalism, laying out the entire scheme in meticulous, undeniable detail. It had scans of the land deeds, the shell company's registration, and damning quotes from unnamed sources within the Port Authority questioning the unusual urgency of the project. In Washington, D.C., the newspaper landed on Senator Thompson's desk with a heavy thud. He stared at the headline, the blood draining from his face. It was all there. Every dirty secret, every hidden deal exposed for the world to see. It wasn't an allegation. It was a conviction in print. His private line began to ring, a shrill, incessant scream. It was the Senate Majority Leader. Thompson let it ring. He knew what the call was about. Demands for his resignation, an ethics investigation, political ruin, the strikes at the port, the angry donors. That had been a financial attack. This was an execution. He finally understood. It wasn't just a shrimp importer. It was the man who owned the docks, the man who owned the unions, the man who owned the politicians, the man who owned the paper. It was the ghost. And he had been so arrogant, so blinded by his own perceived importance, that he had insulted the ghost's queen in her own court. He stumbled to the window, looking out over the pristine monuments of Washington. His city. But his power here was an illusion. His real power, his real vulnerability, had always been back home, in the murky tidal currents of New Orleans, and the river had just risen and washed him away. The phone rang again, pulling him back to the wreckage of his career. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that this was still not the end. The Port King's gambit was not yet complete. The summons came not as a phone call, but as a single, unmarked white envelope delivered by courier to Senator Thompson's private residence in the Garden District. Inside was a single piece of heavy cardstock. It bore no letterhead, no signature, only a typed address on the Industrial Canal and a time, midnight. There was no need for a name. Thompson knew who it was from. The ghost was granting him an audience. For the first time in his life, William Thompson felt the icy grip of true fear. It was a primal dread, far removed from the political anxieties of losing a vote or a donor. This was the fear of a man who has strayed into a predator's territory and just heard a twig snap behind him. He had spent the last 24 hours watching his world burn down on national television. The Tribune story had been picked up by every major news network. Senator for Sale was the chyron flashing across the bottom of the screen on CNN. His party had already begun the process of distancing themselves, issuing vague statements about taking allegations seriously. His brother-in-law had been taken into federal custody for questioning. It was over. All of it. He drove himself, leaving his driver and security detail behind. The address led him to a desolate part of the city, where the glittering facade of New Orleans gave way to its rusting, industrial heart. He pulled up to a long, low warehouse, its corrugated metal walls stained with age, the air thick with the smell of salt and diesel. The only light came from a single bare bulb above a side door. Standing under it was the compact, watchful man he'd seen at the Blue Dahlia, Luca Romano. He gestured with his head, and Thompson followed him inside. The interior was vast and cavernous, filled with the shadowy hulks of forklifts and stacks of crated equipment. In the center of the immense space, a circle of light was cast by several harsh work lamps. Within that circle sat a simple metal table and 2 chairs. Marco DeLuca was already seated, nursing a small glass of amber liquid. He didn't look up as Thompson approached, his presence as unassuming and as absolute as the darkness surrounding them. Thompson stopped at the edge of the light, his expensive suit feeling ridiculous in this gritty cathedral of labor and shadows. His heart hammered against his ribs. He had given speeches to thousands, negotiated with world leaders, but he had never felt so utterly powerless. "Sit, Senator," Marco said, his voice quiet but carrying easily in the cavernous space. Thompson sat, his hands trembling slightly as he placed them on the table. "DeLuca, I'm here to—" "You're here to listen," Marco interrupted, finally raising his eyes. They were not angry. They were worse. They were cold, patient, and utterly devoid of mercy. "You came into my city. You tried to poison the well for your own greed, and you insulted my wife. Of those 3 sins, only the last one is unforgivable. The first 2 were merely business. The last one was a declaration of war. You just didn't realize you were the only one who didn't have an army." He took a slow sip of his drink. "You think your power comes from a vote, from a title. You're wrong. Power here comes from respect. It's the currency of this city. And you, Senator, are bankrupt." Thompson's face, once a mask of political confidence, crumpled. "What do you want? Money? I'll give you anything. Just make this stop." Marco let out a short, humorless laugh. "Money? You still don't understand. This was never about money. This is about restoring balance. This is about a lesson, a public lesson." He leaned forward, the light catching the hard planes of his face. "Here are my terms. There is no negotiation." He laid them out, his voice a calm, steady blade. "First, the public apology. A full press conference. Tomorrow. You and your son. You will not read from a script. You will look into the camera. You will say Eliza Moreau's name, and you will apologize for your arrogance, your disrespect, and your behavior. You will state that she did nothing wrong, and that you and your son were entirely at fault. You will take no questions. You will simply confess your sins to the world and walk away." Thompson swallowed hard, the humiliation a bitter taste in his mouth. "It will be done. Second, you will publicly withdraw all support for the new terminal project. You will cite the troubling ethical questions that have been raised. Then you will announce that you are not seeking re-election. You will retire from public life. Your political career is over. You will become a ghost, just like you tried to make my wife feel." This was the killing blow. His entire life's ambition erased. But he saw in Marco's eyes that this point was immutable. "I understand," he whispered, the words feeling like shards of glass in his throat. "Third, your son." Marco's voice dropped, becoming even colder. "He will not be joining you at the press conference. His apology will be different. For 1 year, he will work for the New Orleans Music and Heritage Foundation. not as a board member, as a janitor. He will clean the floors, take out the trash, and set up for the free community concerts. He will be paid minimum wage. He will learn what it is to be the help. He will learn to be invisible. If he quits, if he complains, if he is seen in a single nightclub or at a single society event, I will release the documentation I have on your family's offshore accounts to the IRS. Is that clear? The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It was not a punishment of violence, but of ego, a slow, grinding erasure of a privileged life. It's clear, Thompson choked out. Finally, Marco stood up, signaling the end of the audience. You will create a foundation, the Songbird Fund. You will endow it with $50 million. Its mission will be to provide grants, health care, and legal support to working musicians in the French Quarter, so they never have to endure the disrespect of men like you ever again. The foundation's chairwoman will be Eliza Moreau. Thompson stared at him, a dawning horror in his eyes. He wasn't just being forced to pay. He was being forced to build a monument to his own disgrace, a permanent legacy of his humiliation, and put the woman he insulted in charge of it. It was a checkmate of staggering genius. Your first deposit is due by sunrise, Marco said, turning his back. Now get out of my city's heart. The press conference was a media circus. Senator Thompson stood alone at the podium, a pale, broken man. He looked directly into the cameras, his voice hollow but steady, and delivered the apology as commanded. He announced his retirement. He disavowed the terminal project. He never mentioned Marco DeLuca. He didn't have to. The message was clear to anyone who knew how to listen. In New Orleans, the river had chosen a new course. Eliza watched it all from the living room of her home, her hand resting on Marco's. She didn't feel triumph, only a profound, somber sense of justice. She saw the raw power that had moved beneath the surface of her life, and she was not afraid. She understood it was the same fierce, protective force she felt in his arms every night. In the weeks that followed, the city recalibrated. Carter Thompson, his face a mask of sullen fury, was seen hauling trash cans outside a community center. The Songbird Fund was established, and Eliza, with a grace and wisdom that surprised everyone but her husband, embraced her new role. She became a fierce advocate, a protector for the artists who gave the city its soul. Her voice, once a source of entertainment, was now a source of power. Life returned to its rhythm. The port ran smoothly. The unions were quiet. The political landscape shifted. Marco DeLuca's name was never mentioned in any of it. He remained in the shadows, running his seafood company, a quiet businessman in a city full of loud noises. Months later, on a warm, star-dusted evening, Eliza was back on stage at the Blue Dahlia. The club was packed, the energy electric. She had become a legend, a symbol of the city's resilient spirit. Her voice, always beautiful, now carried a new depth, a new authority. It was the voice of a woman who knew her worth. She began her final song, a slow, powerful ballad about love and hidden strength. Her eyes scanned the darkened room, past the rapt faces of the audience, to the shadowed alcove in the back. He was there, as he always was, a silhouette in the darkness. He wasn't watching the performer. He was watching his wife. Their eyes met across the smoky room. In that silent, shared gaze, the entire story was told. The insult, the pain, the quiet, earth-moving rage. The war waged in shadows, the victory that was not about destruction, but about the unwavering defense of one's beloved. She held his gaze, and as the final soaring note of the song filled the room, she poured every ounce of her love, her gratitude, her understanding into it. It was a note of pure, unadulterated triumph, a love song to the silent king who ruled the city's heart and hers. The applause was deafening, a roar of adoration. But Eliza and Marco heard nothing but the quiet, perfect rhythm of their own world, a world where the port king had played his gambit, not for an empire of ships and steel, but for the sanctity of a single beautiful song. And he had won.